and this is a psychological operation. The Chechens, we know, have been very important to Putin personally. And I think this also may be sending a little message saying we're getting quite close to you.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined once again by Robert Fox, who's been a journalist for more than 50 years, during which time he's covered conflicts in the Balkans, the Middle East and the Falklands. He's also the author of multiple books and is currently defence editor for the London Standard, and we always appreciate his time. Robert, welcome back to Frontline.
Hello.
Well, we have plenty to discuss today. We're going to come on to the war in Ukraine in due course. But first of all, I must get your reaction to the announcement we had overnight from Donald Trump about Gaza. What do you make of it?
Well, it was an extraordinary intervention in which, quite clearly, President Trump was promising more than he could ever really realistically deliver. In other words, that America temporarily, albeit, could take over the Gaza Strip, organize a transformation of population, namely moving more than 2 million Gazans in wretched conditions currently out, either to strike out the above. He was saying Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, all of whom have given an immediate thumbs down to it, which I think would be kind of a blow to the vanity of Trump, because what the big game really appears to be over the head of the Gazans is to get Israel on board with a new version of the Abraham Accords, embracing Saudi Arabia.
But I mean, Saudi Arabia have said that a prerequisite for signing the Abraham Accords is a commitment to a Palestinian state, which appears to be completely off the table, judging by what Trump and Netanyahu said last night.
Yes, but there are many voices here. By the way, there are not two strong voices in the Trump administration, as it is now constituted, that believe in a Palestinian state as such. And the difficulty, James, is that, yes, Saudi, Jordan, and I think Egypt and the UAE, and they're the ones that really count, will say you cannot do this without moving the Palestinians to some kind of statehood. Because in the play out from the extraordinary news conference that Trump gave is, no Palestinians pro tem for the time being in Gaza. And by the way, we are signing up to the Smotrich Ben Gvir recipe for the West Bank, for Judea and Samaria becoming an integral part of the wider Israel, very much part of the big Israel, almost Kahanite dream. And look what's been going on in Jenin over the last few weeks. I mean, is this the thing that Trump is really signing up to? It is really the story at the slave of the Roman emperor's triumph. I think Trump needs the equivalent of the slave in the imperial chariot at a great Roman triumph ceremony, who had to whisper famously, "You too, Caesar, are mortal. You too are faced with death. You cannot do this thing," because in a way, the rhetoric is interesting and I do think this is different from the first time around from 2017, is that it is extravagant. It's extravagant in a sort of almost, to go back to crude post-Freudianism, super ego way, which is both all-embracing but very, very destructive. And at the moment, both with all of what he's been saying, and can we quickly go through the roster from Panama, Mexico, Canada, Greenland, Europe, Ukraine, China, the Pacific, and now Gaza and the Middle East, very much in the frame. There, it is very difficult to see him having thrown all these rhetorical hand grenades, where the dust is going to settle realistically in the next 2.5 years, what Trump can do. By the way, if he tries to do everything that he has said, he simply doesn't have the resources. And I'm pretty darn sure a lot of people are telling him that.
Do you think we've just fundamentally misunderstood what Donald Trump means by America first? That a lot of people assumed it meant American isolationism, but actually when he's talking about invading Greenland or taking over Canada or having a permanent US presence in Gaza. What he really means is American exceptionalism.
I think you're absolutely right. And to go through the kind of language, the historical echoes of this language, it is extraordinary how we've gone really back into the 19th century. Here we've heard McKinley who increased territorially the American empire famously at the very end of the 19th century. And we've got people like the first Cabot Lodge and the idea of American, you're quite right, sovereignty. And it's very interesting that we're now looking in what Trump appears to be proposing a mirror image of the kind of pronouncement of the very apex of the Politburo, the committee of about 7 or 9 that Xi Jinping has been running about where he wants to see global dominance of China. By the way, that does not mean dominating the entire world or even running a world system, but running an international system on the one hand for the benefit of China. You can see this through all the documentation that has come out from the deliberations of the party, particularly more than the state, the party and the army in China. And now you're seeing it with Trump, because what he wants is American sovereignty. And there are bits that where he is not working, and he can't afford to downgrade them and ignore them in the way that he is. Sorry, I'm telling this with a very Irish construction, is of course allies. Trump does not do allies. Trump does deals. He is still the guy who is the property dealer moving from the outer suburbs, from Queens, as it were, into Manhattan. As Leonard Cohen famously put it, first you take Manhattan, then you take Berlin. I think the globality, not the globalism, of Trump's vision, I think, unless he does a lot of running repairs, is going to come unstuck. And I think there are some real crunch points coming up, particularly when he starts negotiations with NATO, when he starts talking to the Nordics. We've heard about the row, and very ugly it was, very unpleasant, the conversation he had with the Prime Minister of Denmark. But look, when he comes up against Finland, very well organized in defense, to an extent, Sweden. But the one that we're not calculating enough, he's obsessed with wealth, he's obsessed with Saudi Arabia and its sovereign fund. But what about perhaps the most powerful sovereign fund of all, which is the Norwegian sovereign fund? Because that is clean. There are not obligations. And this is the way the world is turning on environment, on energy, on the Arctic. For a very small nation, about 5 million plus in number, sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, that Norway really has a huge swing vote. Now, he's going to obsess because of his origins, his mother, about the UK. No, he should really be looking at what the Nordics are putting together with the Balts, because they will have a veto on what he does. I know we're going to come on to it in Ukraine. And I think that they've got a very firm grip on Russia, where Russia doesn't want to have a grip on it, namely over its Arctic strategy, because its Arctic strategy is key to its global maritime strategy. So now, he's got to run that one, and he comes into running the Ukraine North European diplomacy, and he can't say, you got to pay for yourself and pay up. It's not quite as simple as that. And total American withdrawal from Europe is not on the cards. He can't do it, by the way, in the time of his office. It would take more than 4 years for America to completely detach itself from NATO. You can do a crude, I'm getting out, but for the necessary undoing of the treaty would take about 3 to 4 years to go through Congress. And in just over 18 months' time, he may not have total control of Congress. I'm sorry I'm making it probably very, very complex, but that's a complex issue. And what he is doing, he's using a blunderbuss to hit a very, very complex issues like Gaza. By the way, you can't turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. There are the reasons I think we should drill into as to why that shouldn't happen. And the UN and elements in the scientific society in Israel, Meren Ben-Venisti, a deputy mayor of Jerusalem, did a wonderful report for the Ford Foundation, really very, very insightful prophecy of what was going to happen in Gaza. Gaza is terribly naturally deprived. So, building it up, who's going to do it? Who's going to pay for it? That's a very good question. So I think we've been far too flattering with Trump in saying, oh, he's a property dealer. He does things in a transactional way. But he smashes in, makes the deal, looks for leverage. That's the way it is. I'd like to use another analogy. It's like hitting a lump of mercury with a hammer, and you hit that and things shoot in all kinds of directions, and some of them very unpredictable.
But to play devil's advocate,
oh, go on.
Does Trump not have a point? That for too long, the kind of geopolitical consensus about how to approach Gaza has failed. It's a strip of land that Egypt doesn't want, that's become a hotbed for groups such as Hamas. Something needs to change, and we need to think about it radically differently. And this is a radically different way of thinking about Gaza.
It's a Gordian knot, if you could do it, or a wicked problem, something that seems to have no obvious solution. And you are absolutely right. Look what the founders of Israel at the time of the of it leading up to its recognition and independence, finally, in 1948. People like David Ben-Gurion absolutely understood the problem of Gaza. And remember, I was talking about the Ben-Venisti report. Ben-Venisti, I can remember meeting him and interviewing him in the early 1980s. Very, very interesting figure indeed. The population of Gaza was just a shade over 500,000 at that time. And now it's nearly 2.5 million. And they've known it's there, but they don't know what to do. It is one of these things, since we have the menagerie of terrible risk at the moment, and we've had wonderful, eloquent books about black swans, and then we have grey rhinos. Well, Gaza at the moment is the ultimate in locality, what's known as a black jellyfish, a terrible problem that is there, and in its worst play out could have terrible consequences. So you look the other way. It's always been there, and it's very, very difficult to know how to stabilize the population in the environment. Take the political environment, which is huge, and I put that to one side. The physical environment is so problematic. Yeah, we've got climate change, but natural resources like the aquifers are drying up. It has a major, major water problem, which could only be resolved with the help of Israel to the north. In a way, there was a thought, people like Rabin and even Ariel Sharon, hawks in their own day, but then moderating to say we have to engage with Gaza, saying it has to be some two-way arrangement involving some kind of recognition, because at that time so much of Gaza labor went out of this strip almost on a daily basis into Israel, and was a very important part of the service economy. So now, excluding the Gazan population, and you can say, yeah, Hamas is a terrible problem. It always has been a problem. And by the way, Israel has always got to grips with it with great, great difficulty. But addressing the Palestinian population as a whole is going to be terribly difficult, because you see demographic balance appearing. If you take with the Israeli Arabs, who are Israeli citizens, and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir again want to reduce their rights within Israel, plus the Palestinian population of the occupied West Bank, as they would call it, the Israeli nationalists call it Judea and Samaria, plus Gaza, they actually balance out at a roughly around 7.5 to 8 million with the Jewish population. Now, are you going to kick all of that out, or even a substantial part of it, which is the way the idea behind a lot of the thinking of the nationalists for the Greater Israel, and you push it, sorry, just to give an example, and you have to look at the detail of this. Jordan can take it. Well, if Jordan takes between 0.5 and 1 million of the Gazans, it really does tip the balance, because the majority are Palestinian populations. The Hashemite kingdom, that is the house of King Abdullah and his ancestors, the Sharifian descendants of the Prophet, become more and more isolated, and it becomes more and more troublesome. And you could have a hostile neo-Palestinian state sitting right on the other side of the Jordan. Am I saying this hasn't been thought through? Yes, they do think it through. They do discuss it. And funny enough, there's a long interview with him in Haaretz at the moment. I used to have long conversations about it, and they were very humane and very thoughtful by the outgoing Israeli ambassador to the US, namely Michael Herzog, who is a real thinker about this. And we discussed Gaza for hours, for several times, and there was no obvious solutions. But by the way, on the environmental issue and the conditions before it really kicked off with Hamas, with this utterly nihilistic approach of Yahya Sinwar and his brother. It was Samson Agonistes, sorry to call it a thing, pull the whole thing down on top of you. I don't care. If it leads to the death, and Sinwar's on record at saying, of hundreds of thousands of my fellow Palestinians, but we've really got to attack the Israeli state at all costs. That has been absolutely destructive. And you've got the tribe that lost its head, in a way, with the Palestinians in Gaza. And it's a very, very difficult problem. And as I was saying, back to wicked problems, it's gone into the too difficult box. But a lot of what we're hearing from Trump, and I'm afraid a lot of what we're hearing from the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, on whom Netanyahu depends in his coalition, and he's trying to navigate that, it's too simplistic. It is really where the shades of history, the past isn't dead. I paraphrase William Faulkner. It isn't even over yet. And that kind of past, it really isn't over. And it's going to be very, very difficult to resolve. In the past, of course, they had conferences, but those and investigations. You had the Peel Commission. You had Bernadotte from the UN, and he was assassinated. And by the way, this is under the British mandate from 1919 through to 1948, and they resolved nothing. But I think that's what it's going to come to in the end. But you have to have all the major Arabs on board. You have to have the UAE, you have to have Qatar, very important because of its relations with Hamas, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, with Israel, with the US, with Britain, with France, because of the history, which isn't dead yet. France and Britain are very much in it. It's the only way I think that this can be resolved. But there's a lot of trouble ahead, and I think there are quite a few months before we get to that point. But I think we will get to that point this year.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. Let's come on, Robert, to what this may tell us about Trump's likely approach to Ukraine. Because if he's prepared to think this radically about Gaza, and a lot of people will be appalled by what he said. Other people may be impressed by his ambition. But if he's prepared to think this radically about Gaza, what might he now do about Russia and Ukraine?
Well, he might be get back to be doing a Greenland on Ukraine. I'm reading in my latest copy online of the Kiev Independent, which I enjoy hugely. I mean, it's a really feisty, quite prejudiced, but everything is prejudiced in media and outlet from Ukraine piece. But they have this intriguing idea that Trump is after what Ukraine can offer in mineral resources, particularly REE, rare earth elements. And this is the real scramble, because the dominant power with REE, it's got a lot of it, but claims it's not enough in its own territory, is China. And this is really worrying Trump now, because, that you do not get the materials, particularly for the electric car industry. He's after talking about REE kind of be found in Greenland. There's a push to exploit against the Great Treaty, international treaty there, the mineral resources of Antarctica, and he'll come across a lot of local opposition there. But there's no smoke with this thing in the Kiev Independent about them being after REE without fire, because it is the way Trump sees it. What's in it for me? And what's in it for him is that it is quite clear that the main effort of Trump foreign policy at the moment, curiously, for all we've had in the past and in the first presidency, it isn't Russia. Now, you have to ask yourself, it's Sherlock Holmes. Sorry, we're full of quotations today, but my favorite detective writers always refer to this lovely remark by Sherlock Holmes: there's nothing so deceptive as an obvious fact. And the obvious fact is, why is he not talking about Russia? He's talking about everything. He's talked about Russia, he's talked even about the UK and about Starmer, but he hasn't really majored, emphasized Putin, who was supposed to be at one time his very, very best friend. It's because he knows that the two powers about to knock themselves out, or are in the slow process of knocking themselves out. It's as if David and Goliath are actually knocking each other to the ground in Ukraine and Russia, because there's no doubt about the real weakness of Russia there, by the way, although they're gaining ground, which we hear, and to horrific losses on both sides, is that they have never gained air dominance. They have never dominated the main battle space. And this is where Ukrainian ingenuity is outflanking, particularly when you see, there's a new flock of drones from Russia. They've got technology from China, which they have been sneaking through, dual-use stuff. And they've had, of course, the Shaheeds from Iran, and they're making them themselves, but they have never managed to do that. Meanwhile, Ukraine is losing, but it's blowing up refineries left and right, and it's killing people. It's assassinating people inside Moscow. And it's very interesting. As far as Ukraine is concerned, temporarily, James, it seems to be on hold in Trump land, because he wants to get to a resolution which, and one can understand it, which requires minimum resources from the US. It's so strange that he said that the US could take over the Gaza Strip. It can't. It doesn't have the resources. It doesn't want to be involved in peacemaking, in the tangled peacemaking in Ukraine, or which we should say the eastern marches of Europe proper. And that's where his main aim is to crank up the Europeans, say, you're going to have to do this, you're going to have to run your regime. And those on the front line, Poland, Finland, and the Baltics, just to pick them out, really do understand that. And where the on-off commitment of the three major Northern European powers militarily, Britain, France, and Germany, it is very, very ambivalent and ambiguous because of the very strange politics in all three. And Britain is no exception with this, because the Starmer government, if it has demonstrated anything, it does not understand the projection or the threat of the projection of force in a sophisticated foreign security and resilience policy. It really does not understand it. It's as if when they were at their schools, and they're very, very emphatic about the kind of public education they had, good for them. It's as if the use of military power, the utility of force, as Rupert Smith puts it, it was never on the agenda, either in their college, school, or university courses. And I'm seeing this more as a real weakness. And since we're talking to a British audience, you look at the very slow motion train crash that seems to be emerging over the Strategic Defence Review, because it was supposed to be a reform, a modernisation, an updating of the outlook, as well as the capability of the British military in its wider implications, as happened in 1998 under George Robertson in Tony Blair. George Robertson must be having nightmares, because he has been told by the Accounts Department, namely the Treasury, cut, or do not spend any money. You've got enough money. And Trump won't take that, by the way, because the one thing that is absolutely clear is that when it comes to the summit of NATO in The Hague at the end of June, they will be told that they have to modernize and they have to develop a capability on their own. They cannot rely on the deep strength of the US in power projection. And this is taken for granted in communications and intelligence, ISTAR, targeting, but particularly in transportation and logistics. The Western European NATO allies are almost bereft at doing anything serious and sustained, as was proved in Libya in 2011, without the Americans.
Well, and isn't there a lesson from Trump? Whatever you think about the specifics of what he's been saying in recent weeks, he is showing political imagination, and you need that sometimes to resolve these issues. I mean, yesterday on Frontline, I was speaking to the former UK Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, and he was saying, in his view, we should have long ago, but certainly we should be now, stationing NATO forces on training exercises in Ukraine, not on the front line, not in combat roles, but as a training force, because that also adds leverage for Ukraine ahead of potential peace negotiations.
Well, he's a fine one to talk, because he was the Armed Forces Minister. I'm sorry to be critical, and I don't go for the current government blaming everything on the Tories. But under his watch, the cut down of any serious Brigade Plus exercise was egregious. So he is absolutely right. They just don't take it seriously because we're so focus group driven. So if you are in the north where things are really deprived and difficult, would you one sort of a binary kind of question, a sort of polarity is, would you accept a cut or a restriction, rather, in the welfare and national health budget in order to boost defences? Well, it's obvious what the answer would be. So they take it as read. We're going to lose the northern wall, whether it's red, blue, pink, Farage, or whatever. And so they're focused on that. Instead, they should be devising a strategy, and it embraces very much, as I would say, a total reform and a radical outlook. And actually, we don't need bigger forces. We need stabilized but very modern forces. Really, not much more. Army around 70,000, serious reserve of 18,000. But we need huge reform if we're talking about resilience, which is part of this picture, of the health service and welfare. We cannot pretend this is 41 or 42 when William Beveridge produced his report that led to the welfare state. We cannot remain the unique, advanced community that still believes that everything can be delivered, can be given free in medicine and healthcare at the point of delivery. And that bedevils everything.
Just a couple of questions to finish off, Robert. And as ever, we so appreciate your time. We could talk for hours. You mentioned the assassinations that Ukraine has been carrying out against Russia. We spoke back in December in the wake of the killing of General Kirillov in Moscow. This week, there's been another assassination in Moscow. Armen Sargsyan, the leader of a pro-Russian paramilitary group in eastern Ukraine, he was killed in an explosion in Moscow on Monday. What do you read into what appears to be now an organised and very effective campaign of assassinations by Ukraine against Russia?
I read General Budanov into this. I think there is some really smart I fear Machiavellian minds at the top in Kiev. Keep them on their toes. It's very interesting, as you say, that they've picked out a Chechen um, leader in a particular area of marginal warfare. You know, there is a great fear that exotic means. We're seeing it at sea, what is really going on with the cables. It's very interesting how the Swedes have pulled back and say, oh, no, it's just bad navigation when one of the cables was lifted. One of the things, by the way, I must say that they fear in exotic warfare is that they will use chemicals. And I think that this accounts for the latest, and it's a warning. Budanov is he's the director of intelligence, but he's really very, very close to Sersky at the top, and it has been running a formidably fascinating and very, very chilling propaganda war. And he is the master of psyops. And this is a psychological operation. The Chechens, we know, have been very important to Putin personally. And I think this also may be sending a little message saying we're getting quite close to you. It's quite interesting that the front is moving inexorably, but not very fast. But it's the psychology is still there. And part of the game is that we do hold a lot of cards, and there's a message to Trump about all of this, whether it's rare earth elements, whether it's the psychological campaign, whether it's the ingenuity in the close and the deep air war. They're saying to Trump particularly, don't count us out. You can't settle this by talking to Putin. You've got to talk to us. And that is what Zelensky is saying. And that's where there is the big battleground at the moment, because I think the Europeans will be saying that to Trump. You cannot do a fireside chat settlement. Look at the disaster of the two Minsk agreements. They never came to anything. And a lot of what Putin is proposing is a retread of the Minsk agreements. No NATO, neutrality, disarmament, get rid of Zelensky, give us the territory we've got, and a little bit more. Zelensky, he is in difficulty, but when he's looking at nearly 100,000 Russian troops being lost, killed, wounded, whatever, every 2 months at the moment, he knows things aren't looking too good in Moscow either.
And just finally on Zelensky, he gave an interview to Piers Morgan yesterday in which he said that if Ukraine isn't allowed to join NATO for the time being, then it should be either given nuclear weapons or allowed to develop its own. Do you agree?
I think it's a very clever move, because what he is doing is going back to the Budapest Agreement, which is what the Russians tried to ignore, whereby in 93, 94, was it that in Budapest, and Britain was a key broker in this, that they gave up their vast nuclear reserve, because a lot of the Soviet nuclear resources, the manufacture and the preparation for deployment was in Ukraine, in order to have it understood that Ukraine would be an independent, sovereign nation. And this is the thing. Of course, it's well before Putin's time. It's 6 years or 5 years, 1999, that before Putin really gets to the apex of power, and Yeltsin hands over to him. And so he denies this. And but Zelensky is playing on that chord, and he's playing on something which is very interesting and very important and galling for the Russians, and it's why it makes Poland very strong and very vulnerable, in that they have a formidable defense industry. Ukraine now manufactures, I believe it's in terms of conventional drones of all times, probably about 40 times what the rest of European NATO manufactures in a year. There's tremendous ingenuity there, but it's people that they've got an exhausted population. They've got a population that went away. The population of sophisticated city dwellers, no longer obedient to the state, who are very reluctant to return to this terrible grind. But I think that I think we will see something happen in Ukraine by the late summer. And I think NATO will have to take the lead. And there's one person we haven't talked about, and he's as cunning as a fox in his very quiet, very flat country way, probably one of the most experienced politicians of them all, and very different from his predecessors, Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO. Mark Rutte has said, dangled in front of Zelensky and the Kiev Independent, my favorite thing, he has a secret plan. Whether he has one or not, I don't care. He is really taking the initiative in a way that the tougher Scandinavians like Stoltenberg and the wonderful Danes that held that job, I think he's going to be an innovative Secretary General of NATO, because he knows what's going to happen. NATO is going to become more articulated. There's going to be European NATO, which will have to take charge of European affairs. And that is a demand where Trump has been articulate, has been relatively, for all the rhetoric, well, they've got to pay more money for their defense, but has been relatively, in his own terms, understated. But he really means it.
Robert, I love these conversations. I could talk to you for hours. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us once again on Frontline.
Pleasure.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.